Michael Crichton made a film that predicted deepfakes 40 years ago. The 80s had dozens of awesome sci-fi movies that got buried by Star Wars, and I found 12 of them that deserve way more attention. Mark Hamill made a sci-fi movie in 1989 that almost nobody saw, and years later he called it one of his favorite movies he's ever been in. This was between the original Star Wars trilogy and the sequels, when Hamill was mostly doing voice work, the Joker and Batman shows and games, but he kept taking live-action roles in smaller films, and Slipstream was one of them. It's set on a near-future Earth that's been destroyed by pollution and natural disasters, a barren wasteland where bounty hunters fight with police over who gets to bring in criminals. The cast includes Bill Paxton and Ben Kingsley. Steven Lisberger directed it, the guy who made Tron. Legitimate talent. But the movie came and went. Most people have never even heard of it. What's interesting is Hamill still brings it up decades later. Most actors wouldn't bother talking about a movie that flopped and disappeared, but he genuinely loves it. That's kind of great, actually. Luc Besson made The Fifth Element in the 90s, which became this huge, defining sci-fi movie. More recently, he made Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets, which is actually better than people gave it credit for. But Besson actually has a third sci-fi movie in his filmography that almost nobody knows about, and it was his first film. The Last Battle came out in France in 1983. The movie has almost no dialogue. Not because they were trying to be artsy for the sake of it, but because the story is about a post-apocalyptic world where humanity has lost the ability to speak. The characters don't even have names, and the crazy thing is it works. You can watch this movie without knowing French because there's basically nothing to understand language-wise. It's all visual storytelling. For a directorial debut, it's remarkably assured. The movie's aged way better than most first films do. But because it was a French film with no dialogue that came out in 1983, it never found much of an audience outside France. And even in France, it's mostly forgotten now. People know Luc Besson for Fifth Element, maybe for Valerian. Nobody talks about the movie that started it all. Battle Beyond the Stars was one of the first films written by John Sayles, who later got Oscar nominations for Passion Fish and Lone Star. And the art direction and special effects were handled by some guy named James Cameron. This was 1980. None of these people were big names yet. They were all just working on this Roger Corman production about space cowboys and barbarian armies and alien clones. It's an ambitious sci-fi fantasy and a bit of a callback to the campy 50s and 60s adventure movies. And it's very much a Roger Corman movie. It's cheap and scrappy and made fast. But Corman had this knack for either creating or attaching himself to movies that got written off when they came out but ended up being appreciated later. They called him the King of Cult for a reason. Battle Beyond the Stars didn't make much noise in 1980. It was just another low-budget sci-fi movie in a year that had Empire Strikes Back. 1982 was a massive year for sci-fi. You had E.T., you had The Thing, you had Tron, and you had Blade Runner, which basically invented the cyberpunk subgenre. Blade Runner came out in June, and that same year, another cyberpunk film came out called Liquid Sky. Terrible timing. There was no way it wasn't going to get completely buried. Liquid Sky looks like an early MTV music video. This was the era of Duran Duran, The Human League, The Cure. That new wave aesthetic was everywhere in music and fashion. The movie opens during a new wave fashion show in Manhattan, introduces these rival models played by the same actor, Anna Carlisle. It taps into the same cultural moment Blade Runner was tapping into, that post-punk cyberpunk vibe. But while Blade Runner was this big Ridley Scott production, Liquid Sky was a small independent film that got swallowed up and forgotten. The movie's pretty adult. It doesn't hold back in showing seedy Manhattan that gets invaded by a dangerous alien. It's not for everyone. But if you're into Blade Runner and that whole aesthetic it was pulling from, Liquid Sky is worth tracking down. The problem was just timing. Coming out the same year as Blade Runner meant nobody was going to pay attention to another cyberpunk movie, especially a small indie one. It developed this tiny cult following over the years, but most people still have no idea it exists. Everyone talks about Brazil when they bring up Terry Gilliam's sci-fi work from the 80s, but 3 years before Brazil, Gilliam made Time Bandits, and nobody ever mentions it. Gilliam called it part of his trilogy of imagination, along with Brazil and Baron Munchausen. Time Bandits is by far the roughest looking of the three. The sets look like the crew built them out of whatever they found in a junkyard. Costumes have this handmade quality. Everything feels a little janky, which is exactly why some people love it more than Brazil. The plot follows some bandits who figured out there are holes in time they can exploit, so they're hopping around stealing famous artifacts from history. They run into Napoleon, Robin Hood, all these historical and fictional figures. Getting time travel right in a movie is incredibly difficult. Time Bandits isn't as clean as Back to the Future, not even close. But it's doing something different with the concept that actually works, and it keeps getting buried under Brazil's shadow even though they're completely different movies. Charlie Sheen was 21 in 1986 and had one of the best years any young actor has ever had. Platoon, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Lucas in this little sci-fi movie called The Wraith. 4 movies in 1 year. 3 of them became classics that people still watch, but nobody remembers The Wraith. The Wraith's got this convoluted plot where Sheen plays a character who's both the ghost of a murdered teenager and also another kid who's pretending to be the original. I'm not going to explain it further than that because it'll ruin the whole thing. Trying to describe it makes it sound worse than it is. The movie's got some legitimate, surprising twists, and the story actually holds together once you're watching it. Sheen never went back to sci-fi after this, which makes The Wraith this weird one-off in his career. Kids and sci-fi were everywhere in the 80s. E.T. dominated everything, but you also had Explorers, Flight of the Navigator, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Family-friendly sci-fi was having this golden age. D.A.R.Y.L came out right in the middle of all that and somehow got completely lost. Barrett Oliver plays the main character fresh off the never-ending story. D.A.R.Y.L stands for Data Analyzing Robot Youth Life Form, which is exactly what he is, a robot built by some shadowy organization. He escapes with help from a sympathetic scientist and ends up bouncing through foster care until he lands with this couple played by Mary Beth Hurt and Michael McKean. He's trying to act like a normal kid, go to school and make friends, but obviously the people who created him eventually show up looking for him. It's a genuinely solid movie that just had the bad luck of coming out when there were 5 other kid-led sci-fi movies every year. Got buried in the pile. The 80s were a great time for campy movies that knew exactly what they were doing. Trauma was pumping them out. John Carpenter was making them an art form. Camp, sci-fi, and horror all crashed together that decade in the best ways. Night of the Comet is one of the best examples of that collision. The cast is perfect. Catherine Mary Stewart from Flight of the Navigator, Kelly Maroney from Chopping Mall, Robert Beltran, who ended up on Star Trek Voyager later. They're all playing it completely straight, which is what makes the camp actually work. A comet passes Earth and vaporizes most of the population. The handful of survivors now have to deal with zombies that the comet also created for some reason. It's ridiculous, and the movie knows it's ridiculous, which is the whole point. Night of the Comet's biggest contribution has nothing to do with the movie itself. Joss Whedon saw it, and it gave him the idea for Buffy Summers. Which is wild because Buffy became this huge cultural phenomenon, and Night of the Comet is mostly forgotten. Michael Crichton wrote Jurassic Park, but he also wrote The Andromeda Strain, Timeline, Congo, and Sphere. The guy was everywhere in sci-fi for decades, but people forget that sometimes he'd skip writing a book entirely and just write directly for the screen. He did that with the original Westworld, and he did it with a 1981 movie called Looker that basically nobody remembers. Looker was about how media controls people, specifically about how much power physical attractiveness has over us. Crichton predicted the mainstream popularity of plastic surgery back in 1981. He also predicted computer-generated celebrities. It feels obvious now, but was completely insane to imagine back then. The movie had the first true CGI character ever used in a film. It used 3D computer shading before Tron did, but Tron came out a year later and got all the credit. Tron became the poster child for early computer effects, even though Looker did it first. When the Ice Pirates came out, everyone compared it to Star Wars, which makes sense. It's about space pirates going on intergalactic adventures, but it was also pulling from Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica, Mad Max, and Indiana Jones. It was this big mashup that made fun of sci-fi while clearly loving it at the same time. But despite all the silliness, you can tell they wanted this to be the start of a franchise. The production felt ambitious, like they were building something that could keep going. Then it got terrible reviews and bombed at the box office. That was the end of that. And here's what's frustrating about it. The Ice Pirates was doing the sci-fi comedy parody thing years before the movies that actually got famous for it. Spaceballs came out in 1987. Red Dwarf started in 1988. Mars Attacks came out in 1996. The Ice Pirates was first, and it clearly had the bones of something that could have been special if they'd gotten to make sequels and build out that universe, but it came out at the wrong time, got compared unfavorably to Star Wars, and disappeared. Most of the movies I'm talking about today got lukewarm reviews at best. Miracle Mile is different. Critics actually liked it when it came out. Good reviews, strong word of mouth from the people who saw it. Audiences just didn't show up, and for whatever reason, it never got that second life on VHS. The entire movie takes place in real time over a single night. The premise is that the world gets whipped into a frenzied panic over an impending nuclear war that's supposedly about to turn Earth into a wasteland. Except the twist is that the war might not even be coming. All the hysteria might be based on information that isn't credible at all. When it came out in 1988, that felt timely because of Cold War tensions. But watching it now, it feels even more relevant. Panic spreading from questionable news sources, people making life or death decisions based on information they can't verify. That's not 1988, that's right now. In Japan, this movie was a massive hit. It was called Day of Resurrection, and it was the most expensive movie ever produced in Japan. It had an international cast with George Kennedy, Olivia Hussey, Robert Vaughn, and Sonny Chiba, who American audiences knew pretty well by then. The story was about a man-made virus that gets released and causes a pandemic. It all leads to riots and widespread civil unrest. If you liked movies like Outbreak, 12 Monkeys, or Quarantine, Virus did all of that first. They screened a rough cut at the 1980 Cannes Film Festival under the title Virus. Should have been huge, right? International cast, big budget, timely subject matter, except Akira Kurosawa had a movie at Cannes that year called Kagemusha, and Kagemusha was the toast of the festival. Everyone was talking about it, nobody paid attention to Virus. It got a release on home video in the West a few years later, but with basically zero promotion because nobody knew anything about it. So this expensive, well-made pandemic movie with a recognizable cast just vanished. And finding it now is nearly impossible, which is insane considering how many pandemic movies we've gotten since.